And welcome back to the Barry Foster Show, coming to you from the beautiful Ridge Florist Studios in the city of Charm, Avon Park, Florida. Glad to have you with us. And I want to remind you, if you have any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions, just put them in the comments below. If you have guests you'd like to hear, topics you'd like to hear us discuss, we're always glad to hear that and respond. Like and subscribe and tell your friends. We are delighted to have today Charles Mendez, a great history at Sebring, a winner of the 12 Hours, a promoter of the 12 Hours, now working with the Automobile Racing Club of Florida with Ford Heacock to kind of revive the history of the race. Charles, it's wonderful to have you with us, my friend.
Well, thank you, Barry. It's a real privilege to be with you today, and it's always a privilege and pleasure to talk about Sebring and the history of Sebring. I'll briefly talk about the end before I talk about the beginning, but Ford Heacock and I reconnected a few years ago after our first introduction, which was back in 1978. And Ford had told me about his desire to resurrect the Automobile Racing Club of Florida, to use as an entity to begin to support and preserve the history of Sebring, which we all know if there's no lead in that regard, history can often get lost. So I was thrilled to death, and Ford's a fantastic guy, the perfect person for that, and it's been fun working with him.
So you grew up in Tampa. So were you always kind of aware of the race in your growing up years? Because the Tampa Tribune did cover the race. Was that part of your world?
Yes, actually it was. My dad was in the trucking business, and I worked in the business since I was 13 years old, and one aspect of it was working in the logistics section. So I got to know all the cities and a little history about all of them. But Sebring was definitely a high priority at that time because I knew of the race. And while I didn't own a fancy sports car, I did have a lovely sister who owned a Corvette, and she allowed me to drive that periodically. So I did have an affinity for the race from a young age. When I was in high school, I went down there in '65, I believe it was, with some friends, and we did the traditional first year at Sebring. We drank beer, we hung on the fence, and we fantasized about what it would be like to drive a race car in the race. Obviously, I viewed that as a fantasy and not a realistic possibility, but a friend of mine who was with me at the time told me a couple of years ago, he says, I remember when we were here and you told me that one day you were going to drive in that race. And he said, he thought that was kind of cool. And I said, I don't remember that, but it's kind of cool too. Anyway, that kind of set the seed, although at that time in my life, I was being groomed to take over my dad's business. And my dad was a pretty serious conservative guy. Racing was not on his playbook or on the horizon, although he loved mechanics and automobiles. So I put that aside. And then the next 10 years really were somewhat, I say, tumultuous in the sense of not horrific by any means, but my dad died in the late 60s. We sold our business. So my future was kind of disrupted. And at that point, it was tragic in regard to his life, but I was kind of free of any major responsibility, and I was always looking for opportunities and what have you. And racing was always something that intrigued me, excited me, but I was a bit too timid to pursue. But after reading Ayn Rand's book, The Virtues of Selfishness, which was a very thin publication, easy to read, I realized that I needed to pursue the things in life that I wanted to. So at that point, which was now 10 years later, I set out, I bought a 911 Porsche that was set up for SCCA racing, did a couple of races. This was in '75, did a couple of races. The fields were just not exciting enough for me, and decided it was time to go IMSA racing. I called up my new friend, Dave Cowart, and I said, David, would you like to go racing? And he said, absolutely. So we embarked on the beginning of what we were not sure of as our careers, but at least it would be a reasonable part of our pastime to go sports car racing. And in 76 and 77, we ran our 911 GTU car in 76. And then in 77, we ran a 3-liter RSR Porsches. And at that point, you recall what the 70s were like. Rather unsettling, inflation, oil embargoes. The economy was whipsawing all over the place. And in 72, Alec Ullman had decided that he was not going to promote the race in Sebring any longer. It was picked up by John Bishop and IMSA to try to preserve the race and the tradition down there. And it went through a few years of John and then eventually John Greenwood promoting the race. And every year there was always a story about it being the last race. The track was in pretty rough shape. There was hard to get a lot of unanimity in terms of how the race should be run and what it should be and what have you. But we were kind of on the periphery of that. David and I were. But in spring of 77, Greenwood said that that had been the end of his involvement in Sebring. And it appeared to be true at that point in time. And I called David, and David will tell you that he called me, but one of us called the other and said, how would you like to be a race promoter? And I was I needed something in my life at that point. I'd been through a bad business relationship, and I was finally doing what Ayn Rand said, go do what you believe in and you'll be a better person, and decided that it was time to go racing. And so, go promoting. Anyway, so we set off I called John Bishop, and John said, I said, John, David and I want to take over the race. And he said, I'll deal with whoever gets a lease at the airport. And so I went out and set out to negotiate a lease agreement with the Sebring Airport Authority, which started in about June. We finished it in October of that year. And then we had a few months to basically promote the race. And at that point in my life, in addition to car racing and doing things I liked, this was an aside, but I started some drug prevention education programming that was really, I had reached a point where I was, concerned with what kids were doing in the 60s. And as they went off to college, I was concerned with the proliferations of, drugs and the misuse of that, and felt that if we provided better education for young people at a young age, we might influence and affect their decisions as they move through life. So our programs are called Too Good for Drugs, Too Good for Violence, under an umbrella of Too Good today. And we continue to publish, disseminate, and in some cases teach our programs on a fairly limited basis. But we do about 2,500 to 3,000 school systems throughout the country, and we're one of the best. And I say that proudly because a lot of other people were involved in developing the programming, and my son now manages the programming. But back to racing, because that's what it's all about anyway, right?
Well, the Mendez Foundation went from rather humble beginnings in Tampa to being a nationwide organization, and as you point out, extremely successful. And we as parents are grateful for that, Charles.
Yeah, well, I'm thrilled to have played a role in that. And like I said, we've had a lot of really great people work with us. My son now runs the foundation on the operating side. I manage, big picture issues and the investment side, but it's been very rewarding. And, thank God there are us and a few others that are doing stuff to address this issue with kids today, because as you know, back when we were kids, people smoked marijuana and you could get away with that. Today, the marijuana's 10 times stronger. And if it's laced with, fentanyl or bad stuff, you could be done after just one experiment,
It's
So
horrible. Yeah.
yeah.
I did want to ask you, when you started racing, you rather dove in the deep end. I mean, I do a lot of interviews with race car drivers, started racing karts when they were kids and kind of worked their way up to the ranks. But you started on the deep end with IMSA, and big time racing. As you did that, did that help you as a promoter then, looking at the way things were done and sitting down afterwards with a cup of coffee and saying, well, if I was running the race, this is how we do it?
Well, to be honest with you, no. When I decided to go IMSA racing, I had no real plan to go beyond running a 2.5-liter Porsche. And I figured, I would never spend the kind of money you needed to spend to be on a top team. But it's like many other sports and sporting activities, once you get in, you can't get out. And and when you think you're kind of easing your way in, you find that all of a sudden the pool becomes very deep and you better learn how to swim. So we were just, we did pretty good. We were, I rate us as being really pretty good drivers, not in the level of Brian Redman and, Derek Bell and those guys, but we were pretty good in the second class. And it just came naturally to move up to what was the top class at the time, which was the RSR. But I never really, when we got in the promotion side of the business, I never really looked back at it other than as a business. I didn't know the history real well, and I wasn't looking to second guess what John Greenwood and John Bishop and Reggie Smith had done prior. I just felt that if we approached it from a solid business perspective, not from a couple of Yahoo race boys, that we could improve it and maintain it. And I saw Sebring as a very unique property in the sense that it had a very built-in and loyal customer base, if you want to call the fans the customer base.
Mm-hmm.
It had a very, very solid show or race program, which IMSA had put together with, John Bishop's leadership, and that with the right time and commitment, that the community could be encouraged to once again become an active part of the race, support the race, and those ingredients I felt could lead to its success. And of course, with that, then we set out to build or rebuild the media support, the sponsor support, the factory support, which was kind of limited back there. We're into the 70s, and the economy was all over the board. One day you were up, the next day you were gone. If you were lucky, you could show up again the next day. So, but I felt that there was enough to preserve in the tradition and the history of Sebring, though I didn't know it as well as Ford knows it, but I felt there was enough there, and it was such an important part of the U.S. racing history and the international racing history, really second only to Le Mans, that we were taking on a responsibility beyond just running a business. And that, I think, enthusiasm was communicated to the local community and to all the other parties that helped make it a success, which allowed us to be successful in our endeavors.
Well, you were a Tampa businessman, as was John Greenwood. Did you guys have knowledge of each other? Did you have any kind of relationship when he was promoting the race? Was he able to give you some ideas and suggestions on things that could have been done differently, or that were great successes for him?
Well, I hate to sound a bit arrogant, but I decided that the play was there but the book needed to be changed, and not changed dramatically, but needed to have fresh ideas and fresh thinking. I never spoke to John Greenwood when John left. I think he left. I don't think he came back. I did have an early meeting with Reggie Smith, who had been working for Alan Ullman since the beginning of the race itself. And he certainly had the history, but again, I was kind of a young and snappy guy, and I thought, I want this all to be fresh. I want to come in there fresh. I want to utilize my ideas, not specifically to the racing, but more specifically to the running a business, and in David's ideas too, because David knew racing much better than I did. Like you said, I didn't start racing at a young age. I didn't know a whole lot about racing until we promoted the race, to be honest with you.
Well, I know one of the goals was to get the community re-involved, and you were very successful in getting the city involved, the county involved, and the Sebring Airport Authority involved. Was that fertile ground? Were they ready for somebody who wanted to bring them back into the mix?
I think there were. I think the community members, in all respects, all of those different entities that you mentioned, were ready. I think they just wanted to see a bit of commitment and continuity back in the race, because it had been for the last 5 or 6 years, it had been an on again, off again, on again, off again. And it's hard to kind of build any kind of following or loyalty to an organization that you feel may not exist any longer. So when we came in, we needed to make some serious spectator safety improvements. We didn't have a lot of money to do that with, and so we kind of created. I think we were one of the early tracks that utilized tire barriers and dirt embankments behind them, set up in such a fashion that if a car went off the racetrack, it wouldn't run over anybody. It was, and the driver would not be hurt either. But we did things like that, which were necessary to get the FIA listing back on the race on the 12 hours, and it helped with our insurance. And it really, I think, that commitment with the airport authorities support financially. They didn't give us money, but they helped us in those improvements. And I'm sure some money came out of either city or county budgets that may have gone to the authority. But with us taking the leadership and committing to do these things, I think people felt that we were kind of a fresh light on the race itself, feeling that the race was something worthy of being preserved and saved. So we got a lot of folks interested again.
From what I saw, you got the city to spend money. Excuse me. You got the city to spend money and the county to spend money and the airport authority to spend money, mostly on track resurfacing and safety concerns, which was, to be honest with you, was that not the reason they were going to cancel the race? Because the track wasn't raceable, if you will. So the first thing you did was set about a surface, although it's still very bumpy today, a surface that was suitable for a 12-hour race.
Yeah. Well, interesting enough, my biggest concern was risk mitigation, and I saw the biggest risk as the possibility of a car getting into the crowd. Okay, and to me that was a very obvious issue. As far as the track resurfacing went, a substantial part of the track was on the abandoned runways that were built in the early 40s to support the B-17, and there was another aircraft that was stationed there. It was a training field and what have you. But those runways were like 3 feet thick, slabs of concrete, and to remove them and resurface them would have been beyond our budgetary capability. And so nobody wanted to undertake that. So the resurfacing part was rather minimal. I would say the cleanup, the fixing the press box so the wonderful journalists that would come and cover the race would not fall through the floor And so that, I mean, everything was in shambles, and that's where we spent most of the money. We didn't do a lot of resurfacing because once you started, you really had to do the whole thing, and it wasn't feasible at the time. And as much as the track conditions, surface conditions, bumps, etc., was always the topic of the day, every driver in the world longed to race at Sebring and wanted a victory at Sebring.
So as that came back, you painted the pits, you put a new control tower, you worked on the press box. Did the FIA come in and finally, give their blessing to say we'll bring sanctioning back? I mean, if you build it, they will come. That once the FIA gave their blessing, that's when you saw the manufacturers and the drivers start coming back.
Yeah, no, they came kind of an early part of this. We submitted a plan to their the USA or North American representative, told him what we wanted to do, and he submitted that to, I guess, the offices in France. And it was basically conditioned upon doing what we said we would do. And once he saw that we had completed the improvements we proposed to do, then the listing was granted. And that basically opened it up so drivers who were, had A or B licenses were able to come and race here without violating their license requirements, internationally. And it also began to reinforce and support who were basically Porsche, BMW, Chevrolet at the time that were doing most of racing of this type. So.
Many people don't realize that it wasn't until 1987 that the Sebring Raceway became a for-purpose raceway. That every year, I remember when I first came in 1980, you knew the races were coming because they began to put the track together. They began to put the barriers down, and you had to go to the airport authority around the outside road there. That, by the way, was not very pretty at the time. Was that any kind of a challenge for you to kind of work around the normal airport operations and get the track ready when there wasn't a race going to be in effect?
Well, the fact that we were unable to run full time was a huge financial, let me say, inconvenience, because you got to employ people, not a lot of people, but you have to keep people employed, and you have to, provide them year-round employment, or else you can't get the people, the quality people you wanted. But we saw an enormous opportunity to have a full-time racetrack there. But I don't think anybody was really thinking in terms of what would be necessary to accommodate that. And the other thing too, which is kind of a mentality that I was burdened with, and that was we didn't want to make changes to the traditional layout of Sebring. We didn't want to change the course was a 5.2 mile course. Today it's a, I don't know, 3.5 mile, 3.7.
3.72, I think, or 3.74, something like that.
Yeah. And that was, as a result of many versions. But the fact that we were a, once a year operation, the airport authority didn't want to disrupt their ability to conduct aircraft operations as well as develop their industrial park. So nobody was really thinking in terms of making changes. And, it took a while, but it really necessitated the airport authority to, they basically would not renew our lease. So they took over operations. And I think once they took over operations themselves, they began to see the value of making it into a full-time course and getting the cars off the runways, which FAA wanted. So it just took time. It took some time to change that dynamic. And then when that happened, that's when you began to see the major changes that were, in the end effectuated by Don Panos. And, when he built a hotel, he built new pits, started to make it into a real racetrack, with the bumps. They preserved the bumps. The bumps they never eliminated the bumps.
Hashtag respect the bumps. We're talking with Charles Mendez, winner of the 12 Hours of Sebring, promoter of the 12 Hours, and now working with the newly reformed Automobile Racing Club of Florida to preserve the history. Charles, let me ask you, when you came in with Dave Cowart in the late 70s, you were able to get major sponsorship. Where's the chicken and the egg? Did the major sponsorship come because of the drivers that were coming in, or did the drivers and the team start to see that there was activity with sponsorship and they begin to filter back?
Barry, I would frame that as, by the time we got into the early 80s and Ronald Reagan was our new president, and he brought a new life to the country in terms of stabilizing inflation, stabilizing interest rates. And when that happened, the biggest change occurred about 83. And I noticed that, the Japanese automotive manufacturers and other companies were beginning to push more money into sponsorships. We lived on a pretty meager budget during the years that we ran the race, but it really exploded in '83, and sponsorships for buying the name on the race may have gone, I don't know for sure, but may have gone from $20,000 or $50,000 to several $100,000. So the economy really picked up, and that's what I think had the biggest effect. Now, you didn't ask me about how did I get a ride and I was able to win the race.
I was getting to that, but I do have one question for you. I have read that you had a friend by the name of Peter Field that had Field Industries in Switzerland, which was a fertilizer company, and you had landed there. Is it true that Sebring had a fertilizer company, which I think there's great humor and entertainment value in this? Did Sebring have a fertilizer company as a sponsor at one year?
I don't remember. That may have been after my time, to be honest with you.
I read it was in '74, and I was and apparently, well, as we talked a little earlier, as a Tampa businessman, there's a lot of guys who got into business in Tampa who knew about the 12 hours, and I was wondering if that had helped you at all. But yes, let's talk a little bit about you rather dove into the deep end. How did you get a ride with Bob Garrettson and Brian Redman in a Porsche RSR?
Well, in that period of time, you had to be very opportunistic, and in all respects, and dealing with sponsors and team owners and community, the sheriff, everybody. And we used to do what was traditionally a press tour. This was before the social media and internet and all this. You know that, right, Barry?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I wanted to take Brian Redman, who was going to be driving with Dick Barber, for a press tour around the state, and I called Joe Hoppen, who ran Porsche Racing at the time. And I said, Joe, can I get Brian to come with me and do a press tour? And Joe was like, well, you need to call Dick Barber because he's driving for Dick. I said, okay. So I called Dick, and Dick was a really fun guy, very pleasant, very always upbeat. And I said, Dick, can I get Brian to come out and do a press tour? And he said, well, can I come too? And I thought for a moment, because I wanted to kind of preserve Brian to, let him spend, special time with the media guys. But I said, of course, Dick, we'd love for you to come. So Dick and Brian and I were out on the road. We'd gone to Tampa and met with Tom McEwen, and we were down in Miami, I believe. And Dick gets a phone call, and I can hear him speaking to the person on the other end saying, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, that's too bad. I hope everything's okay, blah, blah, blah. I said, Dick, what was that all about? He says, oh, that was Bob Bondurant, who was to be the third driver in the car with Brian and Bob Garrettson. And he's sick, he can't come. And I looked at Dick, I said, Dick, can I get that ride? and Dick looks at me and he says, do you know how to drive a 935? I said, sure. In my mind, I'm like, you know, a 3-liter RSR is a, you know, 340 or 50 horsepower car, and a 935 is, you know, 500 or 600 horsepower unless you turn the knob up, and then it could go up to 800. I figured it's the same car, it's just got a lot more power.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, he had asked me if I knew how to drive one. I did not have to lie to him and say I had driven one. Anyway, he looks over at Brian and says, Brian, he says, what do you think about Charles driving? And Brian kind of smiles and looks off in the air. You know, I could see Brian thinking, don't ask me. I don't know this guy.
So now it'll be my fault.
He says, so Brian says, oh, that's fine, Dick. So anyway, we made a deal. And I was like, wow, this is the first time I've ever had a chance to be in a car that could win the race, although I never even thought about it, winning the race. We were the second car on the team. And when we got to the racetrack, Brian and I were walking up to the tent where the cars were, and I looked at the back of our car, and I immediately saw that it was a single turbo. It wasn't a twin turbo. And if you probably recall that the single turbos had a lot more lag, and they were a little more challenging to drive. You had to reset your brain in all aspects of everything you were doing on the racetrack. And I told Brian, I said, Brian, this isn't a 935. He says, no, don't worry. And I'm like, but Dick said it was a 935. And I wasn't so concerned about driving it. I was just more concerned about us being able to do well. Anyway, and as Brian knew, sometimes the car that doesn't start off the fastest ends up having gone the longest distance. And it all worked out well from then. Dick asked me to start the race, which I was delighted to do. And all I could think about is don't screw this thing up, you know, because you have a chance to make the biggest fool of yourself as you ever could. But anyway, things went well, and we kind of held the pace to, I think we stayed in well, we didn't get into first place till towards the end of the race, but a lot of the other guys just, you know, shot themselves in the foot, as they might say. And we just persevered and drove conservatively, and we won.
Well, there's only one lap you have to lead, of course, and that's the last one. But did you have any challenges during the race? Did you have any close calls or things that will stick in your mind now forever?
No, to be honest with you, I think I had a flat tire in one of my sessions. You know, Brian was the kind of driver that he would drive as slow as he needed to drive to win. And if he needed to drive fast, he was as fast as anybody else out there. And he just, you know, said, keep the pace. He made no mistakes. Bob made no mistakes. And the other guys had problems and we didn't. We had a great crew, as you met the crew, I think, there at our seminar.
Yes.
It was Bob Garrison's guys, and they just had prepared a nice car and they took good care of us throughout the race.
Well, your history at Sebring is pretty remarkable. You were third overall in '82, second overall in '79, and won in '78. So there's a lot of drivers to be glad to change their records with that. I mean, you had a pretty remarkable run at the 12 hours.
Yes, I was very fortunate. You mentioned 79. At the end of '78, I had now been bitten by the got to go faster, got to have a better car bug, and had, you know, gone from a 2.5 liter 911 to, you know, wanting to drive a 935, which was the best car at the time. And I bought Bob Hagstad's old car, which he and Hurley had run, and put a 935 motor in the car, and basically had an old 935. It didn't have the suspension set up as the new cars. It didn't have the some of the big brakes and some of the other features, which I learned throughout the first half of '79 that it really put you at a serious disadvantage on a head-to-head basis. But we Brian and Paul Miller and I were driving the car in the 79 race at Sebring. And on the first lap, literally the first lap, back then on the old track, turns 1 and 2 were basically a pretty fast loop or a sweeper that took you back into the infield. And as I was getting ready to break in down for turn 3, the brake pedal just went straight to the floor.
Oh.
And at that point, you're doing 100, maybe 110 miles an hour. And fortunately, I knew the layout of the track and went off, came back on the track towards the about midway down the warehouse straight. Got on there, started working my way back to the pits. And as I was just getting ready to go into the last turn, I was ahead of the field. And I knew that if I went through that last turn, which is where timing and scoring was, and they saw me at the head of the field, they would know something was fishy. So I slowed down, let the rest of the field get by, and I pulled into the pits. But that cost us about 20 minutes. And then later on in the race, after we had gotten back into, I think we were back into second place, our fuel guy went to the wet t-shirt contest instead of bringing fuel back to the pits. And we literally ran Paul Miller out of gas as he coasted into the pits, and finally got refueled, got going. We worked very hard to get back to maybe winning the race, and even with Brian's superb efforts in the night, we couldn't catch the car in front of us. So we ended up coming second by about, I think, 90 seconds. But so that one should have been a win. You know, everybody has a should have been a win, you know. If I hadn't run into the wall, we would have won. But it wasn't that kind of deal. It was just a stupid mistake. But
And you ran Le Mans in '81, is that right?
I ran there, yes. Bob Aiken and I had 2 935s that we'd built up mid-year in '79. And the plan for the next year was we would update them to Kramer style K3s, and we took those 2 cars to Le Mans. And I had a disagreement with a Ferrari guy on the first or second lap, and we kind of banged the wall. And I was trying to get back to the pits and stay out of the race line because it was raining very hard, and the cars were pretty much packed together. And I was concerned that somebody might, if I was in the race line, somebody might move over to pass me, and then that guy behind him might run right into me. So I never got back to the pits, and that was the end of the race. And one of the marshals had asked me to turn the car off while I was waiting to get clearance to get back across the track. And in doing so, when I went to restart it, the battery was dead. And the rules at Le Mans are you can't get any, help from anybody, other than yourself during the race. So I went up to see Alain Berthaud, who was, I forget his exact title, but he was basically in charge, and he was with the Automobile Club de West. And I told Alain, I said, is there anything we can do just to finish the race, And he was like, no, that's the rule. So he says, don't worry. He says, I'll make it up to you. So about, I guess it was about January of the next year, Alain said, he called me, he said, you'll get a call from Gerard Velter, who runs the WM Peugeot team, and about Le Mans. And I said, what will he call me about? And he said, well, wait till he calls you. So Gerard called me, it must have been early March. He said, Charles, he says, you will come to Paul Ricard on what was the Sebring race weekend, and to test their car. And I said, oh, Mr. Velter, he said, I can't do that. I said, that is my Sebring weekend. He said, well, he says, I'll call you back. And I thought, oh my God, I blew this deal. And So about a couple of weeks later, he called me back and said, "Be in Paul Ricard it was the end of April for testing," which I went over, and to shorten the story, because there's a lot in the story, but basically went back for the race, drove it was their fourth car on the team, with a couple other young Frenchmen and two young Frenchmen. And we were the fourth car. We were the only car that finished the race, and we finished 13th, which was pretty good for us. And I was just thrilled to death to have finished it successfully.
Do you still do any driving? Do you still do any competition, vintage circuit, anything like that?
No, I restored the GTU car that David and I ran. I restored it with a friend of mine in Santa Fe, and after we got it back together, it was right about when the COVID thing was starting, and I just decided I didn't want to get back in that cycle of, you go out there and say, "Oh, I'm just going to have fun." You get on the track and it's like it's no fun unless you're competing with somebody that was a lot better than you. So I decided those days were over, and the best I can do today is drive the wonderful roads in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado, and I have a Cayman GT4 RS, which is about as close as you get to a race car with a street car, and that's the extent of my foolishness and foolish driving these days.
So now you are, shall I say, hip deep in the Automobile Racing Club of Florida, an organization that is dedicated to preserving the history of the race that you helped to save. You helped to revive Sebring. Now you're helping to revive the history of Sebring. You're kind of in the reviving business here. This seems to be a group that's growing very rapidly, and you're getting a lot of interest in people who want to preserve the history of this great race.
Yes, that's absolutely true, and that's, I owe or I attribute 100% of the success thus far to Ford. Ford has been very diligent and dedicated to this. Of course, he's got a family tradition that has existed there since the beginning of the race itself. So, and I respect that dearly. Yeah, and when you say hip deep, I just got a new hip, by the way, which works pretty good now.
Congratulations.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It really is a lot of fun. Speaking with people who are new acquaintances, but they've been around a long time, and they've been dedicated fans, and they want to see the history preserved. There are a few local guys that have really, Doug Morton and Dan Andrews and the Hall of Fame members, and folks who have stayed with it for years and years, and so it's really fun and gratifying, and it's a thrill. It really is a thrill and an honor for me to be involved with them.
Have you rather hollowed yourself out of space, or there, just as you had goals when you went in to promote the race in the late 70s and the early 80s, do you have a goal of this? Are you looking to some of the people who you know or knew that were involved back at those times to bring those people in and to bring their history, their artifacts, their stories into this organization?
The answer is yes, 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 and yes. We reconnected. We had our crew from the '78 Dick Barber car out there for that seminar we did. I learned more about that year's race than I had ever known from those guys. And Judy Stropus was there, Bill Warner was there. It's been, it's kind of really fun to reconnect, and we're all a bit melancholic at times, and reliving some of those fun experiences has been great. And yes, we want to get more people involved. At some point, if we were able to get this museum off the ground, it'd be nice to get other memorabilia, maybe some cars, that represent the history, which, you know, when you go back before my day, I mean, that the history is just enormous back then. And so yes, we want to, I don't have any big plan. Ford is the big thinker. I just do what he tells me to. I offer an opinion. Often it's a dissenting opinion, but once it's delivered, I shut up and I do what he wants me to do.
So are there any upcoming events? I know the last we had the Le Mans watching party, which was just a wonderful event, and got to see the original 12-hour winner that the Simeon Museum now has. Do you know, are there any other things in the works for the balance of the year for the ARCF?
I don't. Ford and I have talked about that, but we're kind of still trying to figure out, you know, what to do that would attract the level of attendance we had at the Le Mans watch party, which,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest with you, I was a bit skeptical as to whether we could attract that many people, which, I mean, we had over 120 some people there, which was, I think, huge. But I don't know what else to do, you know, to keep adding to that. So I'll leave that question to Ford, see if he's thought of anything yet, but we'll keep thinking, you know.
I know you're driving the roads of New Mexico now. Have you thought about doing any more promoting? Have you thought about promoting any more races, or are you going to be content just to go and hang on the fences?
I think I'm probably going to be more content to hang on the fence and support Ford right now. I'm still, you know, actively involved with our foundation. I'm involved with a couple of startups out in Santa Fe. Not on the, I run one, but which is kind of a low demand role, and I kind of mentor, advise a couple other groups. But I don't know that I'm ready to undertake anything of greater demands on my time.
Well, Charles, we really, really not only do we appreciate you being with us this morning, but we appreciate all you have done and continue to do for the 12 hours and with the ARCF and everything you did with the Sebring Auto Racing Association back in 78 through 82. And of course, you're winning at the 12 hours. We really appreciate your time today.
Well, Barry, thank you for inviting me. And just kind of failed to mention that the Wayne Estes and IMSA and NASCAR, who are, you know, the operators of the facility now, have been very, very supportive of what the ARCF is doing, and as well as the Hall of Fame, but they're more closely involved. But everybody down there, I think, really believes in the importance of what Ford is doing with the ARCF to get our history safely archived somewhere, and hopefully that will be in a new building downtown Sebring.
And when that happens, you'll come and be back on with us, yes?
Oh, absolutely.
Don't go away. Hang on here just for 1 second. You've been listening to the Barry Foster Show with Charles Mendez, winner of the 12 Hours of Sebring, promoter of the 12 Hours of Sebring, now working with the Automobile Racing Club of Florida, part of our racing series. We're going to have a lot more people on to talk about this kind of thing. If you have any thoughts, ideas, or suggestions, please list them in the comments below. Remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.